Hello and welcome to the state of Kentucky for Friday, May the 1st. Happy Derby weekend, even though we're not derbying. Glad you could join us. We've got some great guests this show. And I'd like to start with a framework. I like to think about people who serve in elected office as falling sort of into three buckets. There are those who care about people and who are working to make things better for people. Then there are those who care about politics, and their main goal is to win political fights. Now, you have to care about politics some, or you don't get reelected and you can't do any good for people. And then there's those who have even stopped caring about politics and their party, and what they care about is power and keeping their power. We are unfortunate in Kentucky to have at least one of our representatives who has traverse that paradigm and seems to be now in the power space. But we're also fortunate to have a number of representatives who are definitely in the people space and who really seem to be elected not because they need power and not because they want to win political fights necessarily, but because they care about people. And we're joined today by one of those representatives, Congressman John Yarmuth, speaking to us from his distant congressional office with the kitchen cabinets. Congressman, welcome to the state of Kentucky.
Thanks, Bruce. Good to be with you. And I can't thank you enough for that introduction. That's one of the nicest ones I've ever had.
Well, thank you for your service and for all that you do for us. I've got a lot of questions here, but let's start with the most important one, which is how are you and your family and your staff doing?
Well, everybody seems to be doing well. My family's doing very well. We had an initial scare, my wife and I, because we were at the infamous speedball and happened to be sitting next to one of the people who came down with the virus.
Right.
And we tested negative and haven't had any problems with it. My son and daughter-in-law and my new grandson are doing great.
Good.
And, I say we're all living, his name is, we call him JD, and we're all living the life that JD is living, in that every day is the same.
Right. JD, really? Is that sort of like, well, this is what we hope he'll become?
Well, it was for John David, the two grandfathers. So I'm very proud of that and honored. And JD's very cool, and he looks exactly like my son, Aaron, and so I hope he turns out as well.
Good. What are you hearing about other members of
Congress? You ask about my staff. My staff is doing phenomenally well, and they're doing incredible work. You know, we basically stopped dealing with policy for the most part, and now everything is casework. Everybody is helping our constituents with whatever problems they might have, and so whether it's getting information about what's going to be in the next CARES package, or or problems they may have with a small business loan or so forth. So it's all hands on deck. And obviously we've got a lot of people who are up against it and at wit's end about how to keep things going in their lives. So it's a lot of phone contact with constituents and that work. But we had a virtual cocktail party the other night. We all got on. I think it was Microsoft Teams. I think is the program.
Okay.
And we all had our drink of choice and shared our stories and got reacquainted a little bit. So, but everybody's doing well.
Good. What are you hearing about other members of Congress? Has anybody tested positive, or has anybody shown up with the virus?
Since the initial wave, when there were, I think, five or so members, Mario Diaz-Balart and McLean, I forget his name, the guy from Utah, and there were 5 or 6 who tested, but in the last few weeks I haven't heard of anyone who's tested positive.
Okay. Well, let's move into the fun and games of these days. Of course, we had Senator McConnell's bankruptcy comment about states should just choose bankruptcy and not expect any help from the federal government. And you made a pretty strong statement about it that we posted on the site. And I don't know if you noticed, but we're trying out a new artificial intelligence text-to-speech generator. So it basically reads out your text. And we used it on your post, and it sounded just as good and just as strong read by the robot as it, I'm sure, would by you. What sort of comments do you have now about Senator McConnell's comment?
Well, of course, he's spent the last few days backing away from those comments, and wisely, I think. I'm not sure that anything he's said or done has been as immediately politically damaging as that statement. And the people of Kentucky are pretty smart and know that Kentucky is a beneficiary state, as Governor Cuomo has pointed out rather forcefully.
Oh, yeah.
And that, about 45% of state budget comes from the federal government. But furthermore, bankruptcy is a way you basically avoid your creditors and get a little space from your creditors. Well, who are Kentucky's creditors? Kentucky's creditors are our state employees and our pensioners. So these are all of our teachers,
right.
All of those public servants who work so hard for us. And so bankruptcy would only hurt them. We're hurting individuals. Plus, it doesn't solve the problem that state and local governments have right now, which is dramatically reduced revenues. And so they're trying to get enough money to pay our policemen, our firefighters, our sanitation workers, our teachers, and so forth. Bankruptcy wouldn't add any more money.
Right.
So it was a stupid suggestion. And I think you have to consider this. And people on the conservative side, public officials, and we do it too in some instances, they get very comfortable when they're on conservative media and they start playing to the crowd. And right. I think he was on Hugh Hewitt's show, and he probably thought that was a safe environment for him. But he's paid a price politically for it.
Well, so what are you hearing about aid for states and cities in the next bill, or what's coming?
All right. Well, we're going to pass a bill on the House side, and there will be something north of $500 billion for state and local government. So in the original CARES package, we had $150 billion for state governments and for cities over 500,000 population. So Louisville benefited from that. Lexington, Bowling Green, no other city in Kentucky did, unless the state funneled it to them. But those funds could only be used for coronavirus costs.
Okay.
And while there is some wiggle room there, that's not the big need right now. Again, the big need is how do we pay our public employees? So there'll be much more flexibility with this fund. Speaker Pelosi has said it could be up to $1 trillion, but she doesn't think we can pass $1 trillion, which I think she's right about. So it'll be somewhere between 500 billion and $1 trillion. And I think there's significant bipartisan support for that. The issue is going to be what other measures are in the package that may cause problems. And McConnell has said, and other Republican leaders have said, that a red line for them is there has to be immunity for employers against lawsuits. And while I think this situation does raise an interesting question about immunity, you have to be very careful about how you do it. I don't think there are many Democrats who are going to be for blanket immunity when you don't hold employers responsible for anything.
Right.
But on the other side, you don't want businesses to be hit with frivolous lawsuits because their customers were reckless. It happened to come into a thing and sneezed on everybody and or coughed. So I'm certainly open to consider that. But again, the way we do it we have to be very careful about, particularly because the federal government has basically always stayed out of tort law. It's always been a state matter, except for the Federal Tort Claims Act, which provides for when you can sue the federal government. It's always been a state issue. So to jump here would be a very, very significant precedent.
Everybody seems to be focused on the aid for the cities and the states. Is there anything else that's going to be in the bill?
Well, there probably will be. I think they're going to be, there's going to be a lot of pressure to either extend or increase the individual rebates, the $1,200. There's going to be pressure to extend the unemployment benefit past the end of July. Now, whether those get in this package or a subsequent piece of legislation, I'm not sure, but those are some of the things that are on the table right now as well.
Okay. So in the midst of this crisis, has the partisan split in Congress improved any? I mean, you and I have talked before about the fact that there's what you say in public and what actually happens in the cloakroom and in committee meetings. So it's not always as partisan as it appears, but I'm just wondering, has it improved any in light of this?
I think it definitely has. And, you know, you can look at the votes on all of the measures that we've passed over the last month and a half, and they've all been overwhelmingly bipartisan. What's happened is Republicans have had to kind of give up their ideological underpinnings, and Democrats have to a certain extent. So we're not calling for tax increases anymore, and Republicans aren't necessarily worried about adding to the deficit. So it's, I think everybody understands that we are where we've never been before, and that the first priority for everybody is to make sure that our citizens' lives are stabilized to the greatest extent possible.
One thing that I've noticed is that for the most part, Washington and Congress, at least in the legislative space, tend to focus on the here and now. It's what's the problem that's in front of us today and what solution do we need today. I've read 2 or 3 stories recently that talk about this virus maybe being here for a while, not just summer and fall, but even into next year. And one story said that if they don't come up with a vaccine quickly that's effective, it could be just rolling around the planet in waves. Has anybody talked about that in Congress? Is that on anybody's agenda?
We pretty much have left that to the scientists. What we have talked about is making sure that if we get this initial wave under control, if there's a new wave in the fall, if we are stuck with it for several years, that we figure out how to stockpile all the equipment that we need, the PPE, and that we get enough reagent to do the tests and enough testing capacity. So it's, what do we need to do to accommodate that possibility that it's going to be around a while?
Okay. I was fascinated to read a story, and I apologize for not having the name in front of me, but there was a Republican congressperson who was touting what read to me like almost a universal basic income plan, and it had other things in it that looked basically like he joined the Progressive Democratic Party. And he's walking around, trying to sell it to the Republican leadership. Is there a chance with this crisis, do you think, for actual structural change like universal basic income or some sort of universal health care or even tax changes to deal with that? Do you think there's a chance that this can get beyond just dealing with the initial crisis?
I think there is a chance. I think one thing about this crisis that may be very positive is that more people are getting a better understanding of what debt means to this country and what deficits mean and how much fiscal space we have to do different things that we would have never considered doing before. There are a bunch of Democrats who have a proposal out to give $2,000 a month to every adult for the duration of this crisis. Anyway, it's a serious proposal. Josh Hawley is whom you're thinking of, a senator from Missouri, who proposed I think 80% of your income or something. Yeah. So we put out a report today, the budget committee put out a report on this very question, is how we now should think about debt and deficits. Paul Krugman had a column about this, and we had a hearing on the same subject a couple of months ago at the Budget Committee. And the prevailing school of thought now is that the deficits we're running out right now aren't dangerous, that we can live with these kind of deficits for quite a long period of time, that interest rates are going to be extremely low for
Right.
a long period of time. And we're borrowing money basically at no cost. And so I think there will be a justification and some momentum for thinking about things we might do that go toward reducing the wealth and income gap in the country.
Right.
And I think right now people are starting to understand how interconnected we are and how that job of stocking the grocery shelves is not just an unskilled, unimportant job, that we can't live without that person. And everybody who's had to homeschool now realizes how important our teachers are.
Sure.
And I think it's going to be a whole reassessment of how we value certain roles. And that may lead to discussions about universal basic income or consistent government payments.
Okay. I would love to talk about that some more because I'm fascinated with what can happen. I mean, one of my favorite concepts is tipping point by Gladwell, and talking about, well, you work and work and work and work and work, and all of a sudden, bang, you reach the tipping point. And I'm wondering if we're at that with some of these, but I don't want to hold you up to gratify my own curiosity. So let me ask you, change topics completely. I don't want you to weigh in on the merits of the story because I think that would be unfair. But I would like to ask you how well you know Joe Biden and what you think of him based on how well you know him. And if you just don't want to answer, that's fine too. But I just wondered how, since you've been there a while, how well you know him and what you think of him.
Well, I've known Joe Biden since he came to the Senate as a 30-year-old senator in 1972. I was a staff member on Senator Marlo Cook's staff at the time, so I was around him a lot. He and Senator Cook became very good friends, even though they were in different parties. And all I can tell you is Joe Biden is one of the nicest, most compassionate, most empathetic individuals I've ever known. And I'll give you a couple of stories. Well, they're related. A few years ago, we were on the south lawn of the White House at the congressional picnic that happens every year. And I was standing around. Joe Biden walked up to say hello, because again, I've known him for a long time. And I said, you wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but Marlo Cook's going to turn 85 in a few weeks. This was back in 2013. And he said, "Oh my God, Marlo, I haven't talked to him in so long. How's he doing?" And I said, "Well, his mind's still good. He's had some problems." And he says to his aide, "Make a note for me to send birthday greetings to Marlo Cook." And and then he looked at me and he said, "You wouldn't happen to have his number, would you?" And I said, "I might." So I took out my phone, scrolled down, and there it was. I said, "Yeah, I do." So Joe Biden takes my phone from me, pushes the send to call Marlo. Marlo answered, and on the South Lawn, they had this wonderful conversation I could only hear half of, but it ended with "love you, love you." And then a year and a half later, we were at the White House at the Christmas party, which is shoulder to shoulder people on the first floor of the White House. Biden comes over, asks how Marlo's doing. I said he was slipping a little bit. And he said, "Can we call him?" I said, "You mean now?" And he said, "Yeah, now." And so he took my phone from me, went over in the corner, had a 10-minute conversation with Marlo, which is the last time they ever talked. But that's just an example of how he is. He is totally genuine. I've been in briefings with him. He is incredibly knowledgeable. The idea that he's not prepared for this job is absurd. He's probably, on paper anyway, the best credentialed person who's ever would assume that office. 36 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president. He knows every for every aspect of foreign policy, domestic policy, and I just think he's totally prepared to do the job. But in relation to the allegations made against him, I strongly believe that every allegation made about sexual harassment or sexual assault has to be seriously considered. But I do know also that there have been many false claims made of sexual assault. And so we can't condemn a person just because an allegation is made. There have been investigations of this, and up till now, there's been no evidence from, other than from friends of Laura Reed, that her telling them the story. There were no eyewitnesses. There was a very, I think, important piece done in USA Today the last couple of days by a prosecutor who prosecuted many sexual assault cases, said he tended to doubt the charges. And the one thing I think about is virtually every case we know about involving a prominent person, there were multiple allegations against that person.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't lone charges. And there's never been another hint of any other incident. So I think in this particular case, I don't know what happened, obviously, but so far the evidence certainly, to me, doesn't appear to disqualify him to be president.
Well, thank you for that, for going into those details. Like I said, there's a lot more that I would love to talk with you about, but I want to be aware of your time as well. I noted earlier that if people comment on Facebook or YouTube, we can share those occasionally. And you said that my introduction was one of the nicest you've got. Well, let's close with a comment from somebody watching the show. Let me put this up here. Kentucky Democrat Representatives John Yarmuth and Governor Andy Beshear are two bright lights here in the Commonwealth in an otherwise dim political landscape. Both have been mentioned in the news recently. It's nice to see positive things appearing nationally about our state instead of negative. Have to agree. I appreciate the good work you do there. And I agree with the commenter that you and Governor Beshear are two bright lights for us, and we appreciate you continuing to shine.
Well, thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me on. I thanked John for his comment. I don't know him, but it's very nice of him. And I will say that Andy Beshear is making us all very proud.
Yes, he is. Take care of yourself. Love that grandbaby, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Take care. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Congressman John Yarmuth of Kentucky's 3rd District. We really appreciate him being with us and answering all those questions. John does really good work, and I also trust his gauge of people pretty well. So I think it was interesting what he said about Joe Biden. We are now going to change topics slightly. We're going to have a guest on that has written a really good book. Let me talk about this person, and I'm going to cheat and put up a cheater sheet for me. This is the book, The United States of Distraction. And Dr. Higdon is professor of history and communication at California State University, East Bay. His academic work focuses on news media propaganda, critical media literacy, and social justice pedagogies. Guest commentator for news media outlets such as New York Times, San Francisco Chronicle, major networks. He's on a bunch of board members, and he is co-host of the Project Censored radio show. And we are very thankful to have Dr. Nolan Higdon. Very thankful to have Dr. Nolan Higdon with us today. Dr. Higdon, welcome.
Thank you for having me on.
We're glad to have you. I found your book really interesting, United States of Distraction, about media today. And you spend part of the book talking about how we got to where we are. The Communications Act that put in place the FCC and said you couldn't have monopolies. And then the Fairness Doctrine that said we had to give equal time. And then starting with Reagan in 1980, anti-government, anti-regulation, and we started moving toward where we are today. I was intrigued with some of your comments, like the one that said that we now have a one-party system because they're both pro-corporate. I thought that was a really strong statement there. Let me give it a little more background, and then I want to ask you some questions. You talk about the fact that the news media has been deregulated and that we now have monopolies. The last time I checked, I think it was most media in the country is owned by like 5 companies or something like that. So talk a little bit about what you think about our current media situation and why you think it's the way it is, and lay out some of the things that you think are bad about it.
Yeah, we have a long history in the United States of protecting the press. I mean, this dates back to the founding fathers. They saw access to real fact-based journalism as being essential for a strong democracy. And so their goal was to subsidize the press and make this information as available as possible. They tried to, mitigate any regulations on the press because they, again, believed a free press, and if government controlled the press, that would come at the expense of truth. But they did give us some, regulations. They tried to minimize how many outlets you could own in a particular market. That was the Communications Act, 1934. They tried to make sure you're being fair and balanced. So if you criticize someone or some ideology, you had to pay for equal time and space for that person or ideology to be represented in your media outlet. That was in the Fairness Doctrine. And around the 70s and 80s, we started getting rid of all of these things. And at the time, there had been, obviously cable television and then 24-hour news networks. And corporations saw some serious profits in news media. And I stress the word profits, not an opportunity to serve democracy.
Right.
And the way they made profits were by cutting journalists, cutting overseas bureaus, focusing more on op-eds. And, quite frankly, they kind of adopted, and Matt Taibbi talks about this, they kind of adopted what pro wrestling had done. They tried to break every story down into good guys versus bad guys and kind of appeal to the audience to make you feel like you're on the moral side. And in the process, news media, it's less and less about sort of facts, truth, or what's actually going on, and more kind of about how the audience feels. Do you feel good about your particular party? Do you feel good about a particular sort of outcome or individual? And this is, really kind of caused, we call like almost like an epistemological crisis. We don't really agree on facts anymore. We always disagreed on what facts mean, right? You have a conservative opinion, you would think based on these facts we should do X. A liberal opinion would say we should do Y. We agreed on what the facts were. We're now in this era where people find the facts debatable. As Kellyanne Conway said, there are alternative facts, whatever that means. So that's kind of where the news media has brought us. We know less and less about the world in which we're being asked to vote upon.
So one of the things that you talk about is the corporate profit motive, and the fact that obviously we all have heard of clickbait and we've heard of framing stories. I like the point you make about everything has to be about good guys and bad guys, because a lot of media does certainly follow that. But you lay out what all has happened and how this brought us to Trump and other things. But then you talk specifically about 4 vulnerabilities, 4 issues that are ongoing problems that we need to face up to. Tell us a little bit about those 4 vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and just to put like why we have the vulnerabilities in the book. We were approached to write this book by City Lights Publishing, and they said, we kind of like you guys use your expertise to break down the relationship between Trump and the media. And we said, we'll do that, but we really don't believe that the story is about Trump. Trump at some level is kind of the distraction or the symptom of these decades-long processes. And if we don't address the vulnerabilities that cause Trump, you'll never get rid of a Trump-type candidate or a Trump-type rhetoric.
Right.
And so we tried to point out these 4 vulnerabilities. One I kind of just talked about, that is the corporate model focuses on sensationalistic content. So if it bleeds, it leads. If it's about sex, if it's about fighting, if it's, it can scare you, that kind of stuff leads. That may not necessarily need what matters most to your home life, There's a lot of policy that matters much more to people. It's quite wonky, it's quite boring, but it means a lot more to you, maybe than some like sort of violent video event, for example, that they can show. So we saw the media was getting really sensationalistic. And in this way, Trump is perfect. Trump for decades has been a sensationalistic figure, writing about Central Park 5 or being on The Apprentice. He's a celebrity made for sensationalism in that sense. Our second vulnerability we noticed was a hyper-polarized media landscape.
Mm-hmm.
That is, media officials started making names for themselves by lampooning their ideological enemies. You can really look back to Bill O'Reilly for this in the late 90s and Sean Hannity. They would go after Democrats and liberals, and this kind of got them big viewership. To a degree, kind of Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes did the same thing going after conservatives in the early 2000s, and Keith Olbermann. So we're in this kind of hyper-partisan climate. And again, this was something Trump fit into well, because Trump was able to sit back and just disregard anything said as being false, simply because he would say, it's against me. I'm the Republican, I'm the conservative, everything else is false. You're fake news, you have a liberal bias, etc. So we thought that hyper-partisan vulnerability was huge. The third vulnerability is closely related. It was a fragmented media landscape. That is, for most of U.S. history, we all had local stories and local papers, but generally the national news was the same. We had kind of the same national news conversation and the same gatekeepers. The internet transformed that. Now you can actually customize what news you do or do not receive. Mm-hmm. And in a certain way, this enables you to customize your own reality. And I could talk about this later, but the way digital tools operate, they also kind of manipulate your interpretation of reality as well. So it gets really tough to have conversations or political policy debates when we are in different realities, just different worlds. And our fourth vulnerability is one we're really passionate about, which is we believe we need an overhaul of our education system. Our education system long ago stopped emphasizing civics. Only about 20% of our high schools mandate it for graduation. And secondly, we have the most mediated society in world history, and we don't have a media literacy component mandated in our education. So we don't teach people how to responsibly use media. We just drop an information bomb on them without civics and ask them to vote.
So one of the things that you talk about, pardon me while I change my notes. One of the things that you talk about in the book is the fact that rather than dealing with truth, media outlets, when they get challenged about not talking about the truth or not telling the whole story, they simply do the both-siderism stuff. And I'm going to apologize for reading this, but you included a quote from one of my heroes, Molly Ivins. And I just want to read this because I think it is so wonderful. The very notion that on any given story, all you have to do is report what both sides say, and you've done a fine job of objective journalism, debilitates the press. There is no such thing as objectivity, and the truth, that slippery little bugger, has the oddest habit of being way to hell off to one side or the other. It seldom nestles neatly halfway between any two opposing points of view. The smug complacency of much of the press, I have heard many an editor say, well, we're being attacked by both sides, so we must be right, stems from the curious notion that if you get a quote from someone on both sides, preferably in an official position, you've done the job. In the first place, most stories aren't two-sided, they're 17-sided at least. In the second place, it's of no help to either the readers or the truth to quote one side saying cat and the other side saying dog, while the truth is there's an elephant crashing around out there in the bushes. Getting up off your duff and going to find out for yourself is still the most useful thing a reporter can do. I just love that quote, not only because it's from Molly Ivins, but because I think it's true. Would you like to comment on that problem?
Yeah, I have to give all the credit in the world to my co-author, Mickey Huff, who's the director of Project Censored. He put that quote in there, and he really drove home the centrality of that quote to our argument. Molly Ivins, great hero. This is kind of the lazy journalism that has started to emerge, especially after the 1980s. Again, Matt Taibbi kind of points out that prior to the 1980s, journalists were working class people who wanted to stick it to elites. Since the 1980s, they've increasingly become like a professional class that wants to, rub shoulders with elites. And as a result, they break everything down to Democrat versus Republican, despite, many different perspectives in a country of 330 million people beyond Democrat and Republican. And I think in the Trump era, you've seen the laziest of journalism. I mean, some of these folks, it really seems like they wake up every day, they read Trump's Twitter account, they write a story about how they're outraged about it, they bring on Democrats and Republicans to talk about it. Trump or somebody responds to what was said, then they break it down between Democrats and Republicans and talk about it. And it's this ongoing cycle. And I think one of the things that the COVID-19 crisis has kind of revealed is that level of discourse in news media is not doing anything for people. We had, prior to this crisis, estimates that 40% of the United States population could not come up with $400 in an emergency.
Right.
Well, it's been 8 weeks now, that if they could come up with it, it's gone. Those are the types of policies we need to discuss, not what's on Trump's Twitter account. But that's been kind of the way the media is operated, is as long as you have a Democrat versus a Republican, you're okay. And it comes from this kind of false sense of objectivity. Mm-hmm. A journalist's job is not to be objective. A journalist's job is to tell the truth. And if the truth happens to hurt one party or one ideology, every single report, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Your job is truth. It's not to run from the idea that you're somehow biased because your reporting hurts one party or another.
So what do we do about this? In your book, you've got basically two sort of spaces, and I'll let you talk about both if you wish. One is that you really say that you're focused on two major institutions, which is a free press or the free press and public education. And then you lay out 5 C's. Do you want to quickly walk us through those 5 C's and why you think they're important?
Yeah, I can walk through some of the 5 C's. I'll say the reason why we chose these two institutions is we, on 2 levels. One, it's impossible to go out and perform all the journalism. We can't be asked to like vote on global events and go around the globe, right? We need journalists to bring back information. We need journalists to bring back information about the country to us. So we need a free press. Our problem is, and this we get criticized a lot for sort of feeding into Trump's rhetoric because he uses fake news to deride the press. The reason why Trump's fake news rhetoric resonated is because the press has done such a bad job. I disagree with, Trump, obviously. I wouldn't abolish the press, nor do I think every journalist is fake news. I think the press needs to be revamped. It needs to have some pressure put on it to do its job properly. So we're not, asking for the abolition of journalism. We think it's central to democracy, but we think its current state is problematic for our democracy. Similarly with education, we are educators. We educate students all the time. We're not criticizing education as being, horrible. We just think it needs to be revamped for the 21st century. And our ultimate goal is to serve democracy and empower the citizenry. So I'm opposed to kind of lists online that tell you what news sources are good and what news sources are bad. Instead, we believe you give the skills to the population, you let them decide what narratives work for them, what information they need, et cetera. So that was kind of our perspective. So when we got approached to write this book, that was another one of our kind of requirements. We said we want to make sure it's not just a doom and gloom book of how we got here, but we offer a series of solutions. And, some books, they'll just have like one paragraph at the end. Here's what you can do. And it tells you. We wanted to put a whole chapter, and we laid out what we called the 5 C's, which were civics education, critical thinking in schools, critical awareness of media, community engagement, and more cultural competency. So we talked about that for our school system, and then for our news system, we called Blues News. We wanted to kind of broaden the news frames beyond the 2 parties, focus more on local news. I know we like to get wrapped up in national stories, but what happens at the local level is much more important to you and your loved one's life. An educational news media that doesn't just drop facts randomly, but gives you context and gives you places to go. And then lastly, we focus on whistleblowers. We think whistleblowers are some of the most important people in our democracy. They're brave people who risk their lives, jobs, careers reputations to give us information that's needed. So we need to start protecting whistleblowers, especially since the quote unquote war on terror. We've become more and more comfortable with kind of chiding whistleblowers as somehow an enemy. But they're not risking national security. They're helping our democracy. And we need to recognize these brave folks who do that. Because a lot of members in our press, for example, they ignored people like Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning when they originally came out with their, when they originally blew the whistle. But it was only after they went to WikiLeaks and things like that, the press started to pay attention. So we need to get our press to understand the importance of whistleblowers as well as the public.
I was interested when I was reading your book about the blues thing, BLEW, especially the third one, educational news media. I've actually had some readers comment to me that one of the best things that we do, and we don't do enough of it, but one of the best things we do is explainers, where we put up, okay, this is what you need to know about this, and here's why it's important, and so on and so forth. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, working with the public, between the public and the press, I think is crucial. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the press has largely become a professional class that's distant from the people it's reporting on and reporting to. And I think that blockade needs to be broken. There needs to be more connection between the two. I've written some recent articles firsthand of going to these events like the Nevada caucus, and the press's distance from the people they're reporting on or reporting to is quite shocking. They like to fall around those in power and just kind of ignore the working people who are part of the caucus, who are part of the event. So I think we need to stop that. We need to get that relationship going, and for the purpose of strengthening democracy, not trying to chide the press or anything like that.
Right. What kind of response has the book gotten?
The response got an overwhelmingly pretty positive response. I think a lot of folks have appreciated the solutions element to it, and also that we didn't write another book kind of focused on Trump. We pointed out that there's a long process of how we got here. You can blame both sort of political parties. You can blame a lot of the past, and bringing that past to understand the present we think is crucial. So we've gotten a lot of positive response for the most part.
Good. Let's put the book back up. The book is The United States of Distraction by Nolan Higdon and Mickey Huff. And Dr. Nolan Higdon, we appreciate you being with us today. I appreciate the book, and I'm actually going to sit down and go back through the book and think about how it applies to the work we're doing at Forward Kentucky. So thank you for reading it, and thank you for being on the state of Kentucky.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. And I didn't get to mention, I am from Kentucky. I was born in Kentucky, so it was great to be able to call in you guys.
I didn't know that. Okay, without jumping too far, where were you born in Kentucky?
It was Owensboro, Kentucky.
Owensboro.
Yeah.
Well, if you get back home and you come to the big city of Louisville, let me know, and we can have lunch, or I'll buy you a beer or something.
It's a date. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
All right. Thank you for being here. That was Dr. Nolan Higdon, writer of United States of Distraction. Before we close today, I want to do a little promo for upcoming shows. I believe it's next week. We're going to devote the entire show to an interview with Terry Canfield, and you will want to listen to this. Terry Canfield is one of the best analysts I've seen of what's going on with Trump and our government and our culture and our society. And she has a very different perspective on what Trump is doing and why he's doing it, and Republicans and Democrats. I just think it's going to be really a fascinating show. So I hope you will join us. Again, I want to point out a couple of things as we close. If you have any ideas or suggestions, you can send them to tips@forwardky.com. We'd love, if you have people you want to see on the show, send that too. And obviously, we would like for people to become a member at forwardky.com/join. Our paying members are what keep us on the air. So thank you for watching. Thank you for being with us. And we'll be back next week with the state of Kentucky.